Sometimes black is willing to walk into the fried liver attack because the defense has been well prepared. And as we've already seen, black may be able to survive the fried liver attack with absolutely precise play. Most of the time, that's not the case. But in any event, I'm going to show you a much more effective way for white to continue. After the standard opening moves, the two knights defense, and then we head toward the fried liver. But now, instead of sacrificing on f7 immediately, the best plan is to open up the game by moving a pawn to d4. Now, black can give you a check because you've moved the pawn up, and in fact, that's not such a bad thing to do, but more likely, black is going to capture the pawn at d4. First, just so you know what black can achieve with the best moves, bishop b4 check is indeed the correct move, and then the bishop gets chased back, but even so we can go after the f7 square as usual with the typical fried liver type attack. The queen comes out, the king comes up, and now we can put more pressure on the center by moving the queen to e4. Black should then try to deflect our bishop so that we get rid of the pin on the knight at d5, and then get ready to support it with the bishop at b7. Now this position isn't completely hopeless for black, but white does have a clear advantage, and right here can simply castle or can try to open things up more directly by playing f4. So that's the best that black can do. But let's see what happens if black chooses other plans. First, let's look at the most natural move of capturing the pawn at d4. Now white simply castles, and notice that we have the e-file open for business. We can put a rook there and put black in check, and we're also targeting our favorite target, f7. Black, of course, should try to castle, and let's see what happens if bishop e7 attacking our knight. Then we're still aiming at f7, and it's time to plunge on in. The standard fried liver type attack. And now, because the e-file is open, the king doesn't dare to come out to e6. Let's see what will happen if it does. We play this fantastic move, knight to c3. Even though our knight can be captured by black's pawn, we're piling on the pin at d5. And if he takes the knight, we then get to check. They block with another knight, and we get to pile on two pins. You see we have the pin on each of the knights, and there's no way that black can survive this position. For example, if he takes on b2, threatening our rook and a new queen, we take off the knight. Oh, we even let black get a second queen for a moment, but it fails to the discovered check, and then the king is simply hunted down, as you can see. We can win the queen back. Now the material is technically even, but the game is over in 2 moves. Checkmate. So that's what would happen if after queen f3 check the king comes out to e6. So let's see what happens if the king retreats to e8. Now we can just grab the knight, and when our queen is chased away, we continue the attack by clobbering at c6, and then we just retreat our queen to the middle of the board, and black is down a pawn, hasn't castled, and is in an utterly miserable position. For example, we can see one game from the late 20th century that went c5, and white won simply by pinning the bishop, then piling on the pin, and then setting up a nice little checkmate. So, that's an introduction to the Lolli attack, which begins by our moving d4. We've looked at bishop b4 check, and we've looked at the capture at d4. Now let's take a look at a few other lines. What happens if black tries to put the bishop in the way at e6? White then simply captures it, opens up the center, tosses the check at h5, and castles with a very strong game. Black's knights look a little silly, and the pawn at e6 is very weak, so this isn't going to be very effective. And suppose instead of capturing on e4, the bishop goes to e7. Well, then we can just do our typical sacrifice, and then if the king comes up to defend, we pile on the pin. Black has nothing better than to try to counterattack our queen, but we simply grab the knight, move the queen, and have an excellent game. So there isn't very much else that black can do. Let's suppose that black tries to take the pawn with the knight. That's possible. We kick the knight and then win the knight at d5. So this is quite simple. Black really has to capture at d4 unless he's going to play the bishop b4 check idea. And white castling gives, again, a very superior position. Let's try another attempt to defend on the light squares. The bishop defends the pawn at f7, and then the queen defends the bishop and defends the pawn at f7, but we sacrifice anyway, because after the king takes, we check, and then we sacrifice for the bishop at e6, and he can't take it back because of bishop d5 pinning and winning. At the same time, if black captures with the queen, then we capture the knight at d5, exploiting the pin. So all of those work. After we castle, black can try to chase our knight by playing h6, but that just invites the familiar sacrifice, and it's even stronger because the pawn at h6 hasn't helped any. And look at what happens to black's king. It's all the way out on e6, and because we've castled, we can continue to attack and just keep attacking. And now black resigned in one game, because if the king goes to g6, then the rook comes down to e6 and pins black's queen. Finally, after castling, black can try to hold on to the center with bishop c5, but once again we just hit old f7, and then we can take the knight back for free with a big attacking position. And if black tries to play knight e5, we just pin it, and then we pile on the pin. And look at this. We're threatening knight c4 check, which is crushing, and there really isn't anything that black can do to save the game. So it looks like the Lolli attack is pretty convincing. Let's return one more time to the starting point of the Lolli attack and remind you about the best move for black, or at least the best move in my personal opinion for black, which is to play the bishop to b4 check. And as we saw earlier, c3 is played, and now the bishop has pretty much got to go back to e7. There isn't much choice. We launch the attack as usual, check the king out, and put our queen in the center of the board. Although castling here would also be quite effective, This position is so good for white, despite being down a knight for a pawn, that you can play slowly. And as before, I like queen e4 as a strong move. Black really needs to distract the bishop, but of course there's one other way of doing that. Instead of playing the pawn up to b5, as we looked at earlier, he could play the knight to e5, but that would give us the powerful check, which pretty much ends the game because we're going to win the knight on the next move. So, we've seen that the Lolli attack is a very strong way to play for white, and its results are even better than the fried liver attack. So, instead of sacrificing the knight immediately at move 6, put your pawn on d4 first, and then sacrifice the knight, and you'll have much better results.